It wasn't supposed to be like this, you know? I never expected anything to change, not in a million years. But here I am, looking back on it, trying to make sense of everything that happened. You probably think I'm about to tell you some grand, dramatic story, something wild and reckless, but no. It wasn't like that. It was quiet, subtle, even. And yet, in its quietness, it changed something in me. Changed me in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. It was a Wednesday, rainy, grey, one of those late afternoons where the world outside seemed to fall into the greyness, softening everything. Most of the office had cleared out by 5 o'clock, like clockwork. My colleagues had gone home to their families or their routines, but I stayed. I stayed because I always did. A little extra work here, a few more reports there, and suddenly the hours slip away without you even realizing. The thing is, I didn't mind. It was a comfortable routine, and my office had a sort of solace to it when no one else was around. The hum of the overhead lights was the loudest thing in the room, and it matched the faint rhythm of the rain outside. I had my eyes glued to the screen of my computer, typing away at a report I had to get out by morning. But, as if drawn by some invisible thread, I found myself glancing up, out the window. The city streets below were slick with rain, reflecting the neon signs of nearby shops. Everything was blurred, softened by the storm. I let my gaze drift for a moment, taking it in. I didn't hear him approach at first. His footsteps were muted by the low hum of the office, the tapping of my fingers on the keys. But then his voice broke through the silence, low and steady, like it always was. Emily. I jumped, startled, and turned to face him. Thomas. My boss. He was standing just a few feet away, looking at me with that steady gaze he always had. He'd been at his desk in the corner, hidden away from sight as usual, but now he was there, right in front of me. I hadn't even realized he was still at the office. Thomas, I didn't see you there, I said, trying to shake off the sudden tension that flared in my chest. No worries, he replied, with that same measured tone. I was about to leave, but then I saw you working. Thought I'd check in. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't unusual for Thomas to stay late. He was the kind of person who always pushed himself, never seemed to tire. But the fact that he'd noticed me? That was a little unsettling. In all the time I'd worked here, we'd exchanged pleasantries, sure. We'd spoken about work, deliverables, deadlines, but anything personal? Not once. I'm almost done here, I said, trying to offer him an easy excuse to leave. Just finishing up some things. You should go home. It's getting late. Thomas glanced out the window briefly, where the rain was still falling in sheets. You know, Emily, he started, his voice taking on a more reflective tone. You spend a lot of time here. I've noticed. I didn't know what to say to that. I hadn't realized he'd been paying attention to that detail. We were all busy, but I guess, like many people, I had developed this rhythm of working past the regular hours, getting lost in the motions of my day-to-day responsibilities. I said slowly, as sometimes it's just easier to stay here than or go home. I hadn't meant to say that. It just slipped out. But it felt true in a way I hadn't really allowed myself to acknowledge before. He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped a little closer. I get it, he said quietly. Sometimes, it's easier to stay busy than to deal with or everything else. His words hung in the air between us. For the first time, I felt a real shift in the dynamic. This wasn't just an exchange between colleagues anymore. Something in his voice, in the weight of those simple words, had opened a door I wasn't prepared to walk through. I swallowed, unsure of how to continue. What could I say to that? How could I explain that I felt adrift, disconnected, as though the days blur together without any real purpose. Everything else? I echoed, almost to myself, my fingers coming to a halt over the keyboard. It wasn't like me to be so open, especially not with him. But something in his presence felt, oh, safe, somehow. A strange kind of comfort that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with just being seen. He nodded, just the slightest movement of his head. Yeah. You know, the stuff we don't talk about. He gave a little shrug, and for a moment, his carefully composed demeanor softened. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it caught me off guard. He wasn't just my boss right now. He was a person. I felt a flutter of something in my chest, but I couldn't quite place it. A connection, maybe. Or maybe it was just that loneliness I'd been pushing aside for so long, creeping up unexpectedly. Whatever it was, I didn't want to face it. Not with him, of all people. So, he continued, his voice even again. You've been working hard, Emily. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile before turning to walk back toward his office. I sat there for a long moment after he left, staring at the screen, but not seeing it. His words had left an echo in my mind. Don't forget to take care of yourself. It wasn't something I'd ever heard from him before. Hell, it wasn't something I'd heard from anyone in a long time. I'd grown so used to pushing my own needs aside for work, for others, for everything that seemed more important than me. But suddenly, his voice, that simple concern, made me question whether I had been neglecting something inside me, something I hadn't even realized I was missing. And as the hours ticked by, as the rain continued to pour outside, I found myself reflecting on those words, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted. The tension in the air had become more than just the usual quiet hum of the office. It felt, personal, intimate, like a moment shared between two people who had known each other for far longer than the circumstances of work would ever suggest. It wasn't supposed to be like this, I thought again. But it was.